everybody's included, and it's kind of irrelevant really where you come from, what your background is, how you look, how you sound. All of those questions for me are kind of neither there, here or there. And I think it's also part of the challenge is that how do we make sure that becomes part of the culture of the business? So we've very much kind of built a business, a small business within a multinational that's very much on that basis. It involves, as you will see, a kind of team from a whole variety of different backgrounds, and we work across the globe in a multicultural environment. So I think from that perspective, it's quite clear. From a education point of view and background, I mean, I went to an all-boys school, and sort of went then to and did an engineering degree in a university where I think the ratio was, I think one woman for every 8 male engineers. So it kind of wasn't really that kind of split back, but it doesn't, you know, I've always worked in teams, and I kind of work particularly well in teams, which I think function better the more mix you've got. I've always encouraged teams to actually have a voice, to look to kind of express their views, and you get better feedback and a better view. I think that just comes from the style of management as well you approach. If you set about being inclusive in your ideas and welcoming new ideas and challenges, then you're in a much better space to kind of move that forward. And I think ultimately you take a responsibility, particularly, as I say, I want to talk about this as a startup, because you set your template on how the team will be.
Thanks so much for sharing, David. And for everyone as well who has any questions at all, there are 2 chat boxes. The team are there in the background keeping an eye on those, so they'll pass them across to me. We have had a couple of people write in questions as well in advance who'll be catching up on demand afterwards, which is wonderful. So what we will do is we'll get into the presentation. David, I'll hand to you, and I will go on mute, and we'll interject if that's okay with you.
Yeah, absolutely fine. Yeah.
Points.
Yeah, I think better to be that dynamic. Yeah, no problem at all.
Lovely. And I love, by the way, that you said there, middle-aged white guy, yeah, very inclusive. This came up at our summit last week, and one of our panels had 3 middle-aged white guys who were all very, very different, very, very different culturally, incredible allies for driving diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And I called out the elephant in the room immediately and said, you know, that expression, which I'm sure many of those on this virtual workshop and yourself have heard, that the expression male, pale and stale, I cannot stand it. You know, none of the team can stand it, because we think that into itself is very uninclusive. You know, is there a point in us preaching to the converted, or preaching to the choir, as they sometimes say? Actually, it's about getting every single person involved, and there's so many invisible diversities as well by way of background, and also you know, social mobility, invisible disability, mental health, to name but a few. And so your mention on that, thank you. I think it is so important that we do have CEOs, and in particular white male CEOs, who are so willing and open to educate others in this arena, and also, you know, talk to other CEOs, because that is how we move the dial forward. So thank you very much, David, and I will hand to you and interject and keep an eye on the questions as we go along. And there will be time for everyone for question and answer at the end. So please do pop those into the chat, and we'll make sure we get those asked for you.
Right, so I just wanted to sort of talk about, as I say, we've got a business here which is part of a larger multinational, but it was very much a startup in an alternative energy sector. So back in 2015, we were 0 turnover, and we had 1 person in the team who was on secondment, who had come over from France to kind of set that process. So I really just want to give a bit of background, a bit to where we sit as a business. It's not a sales pitch for Air Liquide at all, but it's basically just to give you a context of where we're working, which is effectively a bit unusual. We've got a business which is growing at the kind of rates that people talk about in sort of digital sectors in terms of what we do. So, but we're working in a very much an area which is an engineering and might be perceived as a more industrial field, but with a very big spread of locations across the UK now, which has grown. So just trying to give you a bit of a context and how that then fits into our wider group picture in terms of where we are. So if you flip forward, please, Layla, to the next slide. So just as a group, we're 67,000 employees, 80 countries, They have more than 3.5 million customers, and it's about a 21 billion turnover business. And it's investing huge amounts of capital. Investment decisions in 2019 were about 3.1 billion euros. It's typically investing between 2 and 3 billion euros a year in terms of capital, large capital projects. And we basically do, on a global level, all sorts of things from hospital gases, medical gases, through to industrial type gases, but we're also moving into this alternative space with hydrogen and biomethane in terms of where we sit. But it means we're working in an environment where we deal with committees, etc., which are, it's a truly global organisation. So we kind of don't sit with a very parochial UK view. And as you can see, the kind of flags at the back are more of a representation of all the countries where we're working in this particular sector of the business. So we're a smaller part of the bigger piece, but we are taking some of the cultural values from the group and the way we drive forward in terms of what they track, but we also have very much our own initiatives in terms of this UK business. So flip forward, Lena, please. So what we do, and I'm not going to speak to all through the words, is, but basically we're focused on taking organic waste, mainly food waste in our case in the UK. It goes through what I can only describe as a giant stomach, which is an anaerobic digester, and that kind of basically produces gas out the back, which is a mixture of CO2 and methane. We filter out the methane, we use the methane in particular. CO2 can be reused in some areas, but we produce that renewable gas which goes into the grid, and we then focus on using it both for trucks and also for our industrial heat needs. But what that generates is we end up with a portfolio of sites, which I'll give you a bit of a view on, which are all automatic running, but with needing of an on-site support, but kind of not people there all the time. So, you know, within our context then, we are working within a European team, and effectively we've gone from nothing to being the bigger unit within the UK of all of those businesses within Europe in terms of our business. So effectively we've overtaken some established operations, and I think that's partly down to the way we've taken as an approach, which has really been to drive that forward. And it is quite an achievement in terms of the fact you look at what we can do, because we've gone through a whole period of uncertainty of Brexit, but we've managed to bring in inward investment into the UK as part of that process, and that's all down to the way the team has kind of flourished and grown together. And flip forward, please. So just to give you a context, we now have 9 sites making gas. We have a potential to make about 600 gigs per year. We're not quite there, but we're getting there in terms of where it sits. And effectively, we're building a 10th site at the moment in Nottingham, which will be running by the early part of next year. And then we've got a really exciting circular economy story, which was with a kind of really interesting partner company, which we're looking to move forward through a planning stage this year into something we can build next year. And then in terms of the downstream operations, we've currently got 11 stations operating for refueling both buses. So you can see buses in Nottingham and Plymouth, for example, we do in Bristol, and a variety of trucks, but we've got 7 more stations, refueling stations for trucks to come by the early part of next year. And effectively that will include at the John Lewis headquarters in sort of where we will be putting a facility in. So we'll have a portfolio of about 18 of these stations which are remote operated, but where our customers are dependent on us both keeping the engineering running but also supplying the gases. So we've got a very strong footprint in terms of trying to drive CO2 and work in this renewable sector, which kind of gives a positive ethos in terms of where we are, and that's why we want to back up it in all the things we do to kind of push this positivity. I think this basically gives you a flavour of where we are. So we're quite diverse. The other thing I didn't talk about was up in Scotland. We have a industrial heat demands which run from a hub. So we go and put gases into trailers where they can't connect to a gas network. We replaced heavy fuel oil again with clean renewable gas in terms of those operations. So we're in a very much a state where we are way over the double-digit growth every year in terms of where we're at. And this just gives you a flavour of, what the diversity of those sites looks like in terms of there. So very much we've got different facilities in different parts of, and this top right one's, for example, in Lincolnshire. There's a variety of others from Telford through down up to northern Scotland, through to sites in the East Midlands that we dropped out. This middle one we dropped down in the middle of lockdown, again to sort of help supply supermarkets. But really, we've got 33 sites then to manage. So the team is actually spread as well. So it's also important to kind of make them feel they're not all in one place. They're not all in one office. In fact, to be fair, we've had the office closed since March last year. There's nobody really been in the office from a working point of view, but that's not diluted the spirit we have working within there. And I think that's part of it. Each and every one of them needs to feel part of that, what we're trying to achieve. So I'll give you a bit of a flavour in terms of our journey, in terms of what we were doing. So if you flip forward in terms of, thanks, Layla. So we really set out to, develop this team, and we have a reasonable mix. We can't say we tick every single box in what we do. We haven't got there. If you actually look at where we go, we still need to improve. We're still on the learning curve, but we've made it very much as a place that people want to be passionate about what they do. They want to be passionate about in what they're involved in, and that's irrespective of kind of where their background is in terms of where they go. Everybody's valued in terms of, and that's what they've got to do. Is it's about the thing that doesn't get used enough, and that Layla uses quite a lot, is belonging. It's about people feeling as though they belong in their environment. So I'm not going to talk too much in terms of the theory. I'm going to try and talk about what we do in terms of what we've done and how we've done it. And we always look at doing that. Now, the challenge is, we've also had to grow a business. We're growing a business. We have to deliver on a business. We have to move a business from to be profitable. I didn't start off with this kind of quite coloured hair when we started. So some of the gas to grid connections and engineering projects are some of the toughest things I've actually had to do. But we've not lost sight of the fact we've put a lot of time into what we do with the team. So if you flip forward again. So we started off, as I said, November 14, one person seconded from France, and effectively we moved into our office in the centre of Birmingham in June 2016, at which point there was 9 people, of which 3 people were coming, or 4 people were coming, were already in the organisation, but based in the centre of the UK. And we were closing an office down in Kingston from another business we bought, where we moved some of those people up to the UK operation. Effectively scroll forward, and we're now at 33 people in what we class as a matrix organisation, because actually some of the people in the UK now have got bosses who are in France. And actually we've kind of gone into more of a transformed organisation, which is kind of some of the services come in the platform, whereas when we started it was all through me. It actually helps drive that forward. But if we look at that mix, out of those 33 at the moment, I think we've got 7 who weren't born in the UK. There's quite a number in the UK mix who were born in the UK but come from different cultural backgrounds in terms of their history. And it's probably at the moment we're about 1/3 female to male, which is not where I want it to be. We definitely got to 50-50. What's really slipped a little bit was that we've been growing our engineering side, and the pool we're trying to kind of fish in, it's just been quite difficult to get the mix of candidates I would have liked to have seen in terms of where we go. And some of that challenges as well is that, we get that difficulty in terms of a business in recruitment. We're a growing organisation, but we've had to be lean. So you have to bring people in who are ready to do the job. And whilst we're looking to develop people where you can broaden your scope a bit, getting people who are ready-made to drop into the role becomes that bit more challenging in some of those areas. And that's probably the biggest disappointment for us. Probably the area where we need to think about is how the training's working. I'm really pleased to say that we're just in the process of recruiting an operations engineer who will actually replace one of the guys who's going back to Italy. And that's been driven out of the team. So they've recruited someone who's had an engineering background, and she's based up in Leeds. So we are getting a bit more positives, and I'm pleased to see that the team's doing that and driving that themselves rather than me sitting over them and pushing that. But I think that's just the kind of direction, and just I think some of the things where you need that sense checking of KPIs on where you are, and you take a step back because you lose yourself in the day to day, and over time you suddenly find, okay, how's the mix developing?
I'm going to just interject with a quick
Yeah.
couple of questions, David, if that's okay, because we have a number of people who wrote in advance who will be watching on demand, who have come specifically from, and I can see someone has raised their hand. Becky or one of the team, if you could. And whilst we're just waiting for those to come through, the questions that I was going to interject with was, we have a number of people who are from or working within STEM backgrounds, including Chief Exec who's working within the nucleus and the nuclear arena, basically. And there have been, as I'm sure we all know, a lot of challenges within STEM, especially when you're looking at very, very specific skill sets. It's great that you just said there, that it is challenging. It's never going to be perfect all the time, but ultimately being particularly, I suppose, specific when it comes to those aspects and elements of recruitment, plus also dovetailing that in with development plans for those who can then do those specific skills at a later date is excellent. But the questions were around how you do recruit within those areas that are traditionally slightly more difficult to find people that may be on site or are required in certain areas within those disciplines or within factories, where it is not a case of broadening the net and have people work from home, basically.
I mean, we tried to do some work with, we've kind of done some work with the recruiter that we got quite close to, who kind of came and spent some time with the team and understood the culture. So we tried to kind of do some of that, and that had some effect. But again, it depends on their background and where they work, and that works some of the time, but not all of the time, because again, in terms of where that net goes, I think we're still learning. I mean, I've had some interesting exchanges with the talent acquisition team in our sister organisation, they use quite a bit of LinkedIn, but had some interesting exchanges in where they've done work looking at the big difference that you can make in how you write your job advert. That actually, if you write them in different ways, particularly in terms of if you're trying to get kind of a mixture of male and female candidates, so that you can basically get more applicants if you structure it in a different way. So again, we're on that constant learn in terms of where we pitch that, what we do. And I think that is the challenge piece for us all, is it's about why are you getting that mix of candidates in there, and are you going into the wrong areas, are you writing it the wrong way? I don't think we always get it, definitely don't always get it right in terms of being able to track all the options and where we go. And we're challenged in terms of the time we have to actually be able to keep doing that. But I think it's part of the process we're in, is trying to understand how we can keep doing that better. And I think it's all you can do is kind of look at the process and keep not accepting it if you think that the outcomes are not where you want them to be.
That's a great response, and I think having a great recruiter does help. I will mention, obviously, on the exec search side, albeit I don't recruit at lower level with our sister business, but at exec side, when it comes to influence, we will be very, very specific when it comes to looking at those market maps. As you say, David, it's not it's not a one silver bullet piece. There is advertisement that needs to happen. There needs to be checking on job specifications if it is for, I presume, for some of the mid to lower level roles, looking in very specific places where you would be advertising for those jobs. In terms of actually looking at entry level when it comes to a lot of the graduate recruitment, what we have heard is, especially when it comes to the kind of the group sessions to get new graduates in, making sure that those questions are inclusive of all, and they don't immediately kind of wipe out certain segments of the market who may have certain disabilities or difficulties in being able to actually complete through those various checks to get through, basically. But yeah, no, I think absolutely having a good recruiter on site and being persistent with your recruiter as well, making sure that, we don't have we couldn't find anyone out there. I know from experience and have seen and heard this come back for large scale pieces of recruitment. There are always people out there. It depends on how far the line can be physically pushed when it comes to broadening that net, i.e., can we look at a greater radius around a certain area? If it has to be someone on site, can we look at someone doing, part-time or less hours in the office? There's a lot of different things to broaden that, and obviously hopefully come together with the hiring manager, whether that be a board member or whether it be someone who is a kind of mid-level manager, to make sure we can go as wide as we possibly can.
That for me is the piece that's kind of critical. Is it's not just who you end up recruiting, it's questioning the pool that you recruited them from. And that for me is the part where we can have question, is if your pool of people that you recruited from is not of the right diversity, why is that case? And therefore not just accepting that's, as you say, basically that's all that's out there. It doesn't seem a fair answer to me in terms of where we go, because we know that there are things that you can do to make yourself more attractive. And at the end of the day, a recruitment process is always been, for me, it's not just you interviewing the candidates are reviewing and interviewing you as well. And I think people quite often forget that in terms of that dynamic, and that process starts much earlier in terms of how attractive you are as a business to come to.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Great point. So starting a lot earlier, keeping an eye out in the market. I know you've mentioned this before, which I think is excellent, in addition to also ensuring that we broaden that net as far and wide as we possibly can for all those roles, and developing talent within or externally when that comes in, to be able to make sure that pipeline is able to then step up into those roles, in the example that you then gave. And look, it's never going to necessarily be perfect, but the fact that there's an opportunity and you've hired a female into that role, which perhaps, obviously just looking at that one facet of diversity, male, female, it adds that difference and that difference of mindset in there. So that's great to hear.
Okay.
We had one other comment actually as well, which was very lovely, from someone who attended the summit and said that they thoroughly enjoyed the panel, which had the 3 middle-aged white guys on it. So there you go. So thank you for that comment. And we also hear around, well, actually some of the largest challenges perhaps you've had so far, in specific around kind of CEO and exec buy-in. That's a really interesting question, actually. So thank you very much, whomever has been asking this.
I mean, to some extent, I've been a little bit fortunate in that, from our point of view, we've been able to have a degree of freedom to move things in the right direction. I mean, to some extent, there are certain roles where we are now at a stage where we know we will take candidates for particular roles from France, but they're coming from a mixed role, but purely because they're at a weight where we need to start tying into some things like practical things like just culture on safety, the way we do engineering processes. We kind of need to be more aligned to the mothership in terms of where we do and how we go about things. And there's things you can do when you're a small business, which doesn't really pick on the radar. As you start to grow, you realize you go through a transitional phase where suddenly you kind of get a little bit less freedoms on some of the things you did before. But I think the other side as well is that, the group has got wider policies in terms of where it goes. And we do have, there is a focus in parts of the business really in terms of some of the talent acquisition have really started looking at this in parallel to the work we were doing. So nobody ever has kind of caught us in where we go. And actually, I think what we're seeing now is more visibility within the group where they want to check those statistics. So actually, the feedback is in terms of some of the ratios, they're beginning to get some of those KPIs reported. But, we don't have a formalized, dedicated HR role in this team because it's too small. And as I say, we've really run this quite lean and while we were growing, because the key has been is we had to deliver profitability. It's a virtuous circle of delivering profitability, attracting in basically investment, and continuing to grow the business and grow those roles and opportunities. That said, just because we're doing that doesn't mean that we couldn't develop something that's trying to be focused on inclusiveness.
That's such. Oh, sorry to interrupt there. I was just saying that's such a great point, because one thing that the team and I hear quite a lot is it's not the top of the priority list, or we need to focus on making profit and everything like that. And that's obviously that is absolutely critical, and it is important for business success. But just because you are if you are a small business, because ultimately you're a business within a larger business, that is still possible whether you are a small business or whether you are a large business. And it doesn't mean because you're focusing on profit, there is not something that you cannot do to be inclusive as an organisation. And in particular, the fact that you're using HR from a mothership, and this is being driven ultimately by the CEO in the organisation, demonstrates this is not just purely an HR initiative. And we say this, and hear this, time and time again from those organisations that do understand this is not an HR initiative. This is a board-wide initiative that involves all. It shouldn't be necessarily HR's responsibility to pick up all of this. Obviously, there are certain legal aspects of it that would need to be on the HR side. But when it comes to the culture, rolling out diversity, inclusion, agenda initiatives, recruitment, etc., absolutely is key. And just one more quick question before we move on, and I will ask others later in the presentation, is we have a question here about any areas of diversity and inclusion that you feel the organisation is struggling with, or any challenges you're having and why, plus pieces that you are excelling in. And I think that's quite an interesting one. Maybe we could hear that from both group and your perspective, because obviously...
Certainly from my perspective, I think it's for others to judge what we're doing well or not. And in terms of what we do, we kind of trying to do, and I'll talk a bit more about what we're trying to do in the culture of the business. The interesting thing in terms of where we sit is we definitely particularly have struggled to get candidates with any disabilities in terms of where we sit. Now, whether that's because we're based in a city centre location in a kind of multi-storey block or any of those things, but we genuinely haven't found that we get any at all applicants which would appear to be, we're not in terms of the applicants we get. So it's a kind of mix in terms of where we see in terms of from that point of view I'm not sure what we're doing or what we could do different that would make it more open to that. So that's probably the next biggest thing on the list, is in terms of expanding that pool is how can we do that?
Thanks, David. We've heard this come up a couple of times actually previously, and I think I wouldn't say necessarily the key here is, but advertising in places that would demonstrate you care around, not saying that you don't care, but they care around certain aspects of say disability, plus the fact that actually disability can also be invisible as well. So perhaps there's some certain elements there, but certainly speaking out and speaking up is key, because the more we hear organisations are keen, willing, want to have these conversations, I think it more opens those gateways for talent. But yeah, perhaps it is the city centre office block location. But it'd be an interesting one to hear how you get along with that and what you plan to do with that. So shall we move on? Just
in terms of what we've done, I still sort of sit there, and I think what we do is the right thing, not necessarily extraordinary in terms of where we go. So it's sort of in terms of where we took the approach is we've taken some real efforts in terms of developing the team, and we really work from a value set that people have got to feel valued for their skills and their contribution and what they bring to the team. So really focused on what they're doing. There's clarity in terms of where they are in part of that process, and they feel as though they're contributing to it. And that's much easier for us because we've gone from a small to a growing team. So everybody's got to be kind of be able to contribute, because we don't have room for people not being able to step up to the mark in terms of where it goes. We've definitely gone down the process in terms of using Thomas profiles, which basically starts to put people into various groups, and there's a whole variety of ways you can profile, etc. But we don't use it from a purely recruitment point of view. We use it because actually they all get their profiles and they get to opportunities to redo them, and we have someone part of the team in the administration who's actually a practitioner and where that goes. But we've used it in team building more to make people more self-aware of both how they perform, how they are trait-wise normally, but also how they are under pressure, and also then how other people are, because actually to understand why people are may or may not react in an environment in terms of where it goes. So it's very much kind of making people aware of what their own triggers are and what others are, so that actually they can find ways to work out. It doesn't mean we don't get disagreements. It doesn't mean we've not had challenges along the way. It's not a panacea for everything and where we go, but it certainly sets that process. And certainly what we've done is we've tried to create shared experiences, and that's got everything from, I use quite a lot in terms of people in the sports sector, particularly people who've had different challenges and have been quite vocal about the challenges they've had. So they may have been Olympian, or they may have worked at sort of high level rugby level, but they've also had challenges in real life as well. So it's not that kind of like, I'll give you a talk, basically this is how to win a gold medal, and basically it's a level nobody can ever attain. They also talk about it from the actual struggles they've had in a different environment, or they've had struggles with mental health, etc. So we very much kind of bring them into that level and create shared experiences working with them. So, you know, it has focused as well on working team days, but also away days about health, well-being and resilience. But that for me is, again, is part of that building that inclusive team mentality. If you look at what happens in, I'm not advocating that in terms of some of the stuff in military training, etc. You put people in experiences which are shared experience, shared languages, etc. So actually doing things which is help bringing them together. It's kind of, and it's no by means that extreme in terms of what we do with people, but it's just kind of catching that mindset where we care for them and we actually focus on their well-being, whoever they are within the team. So and this has been something that the management team doesn't just get to do. And some of the stuff we did, we brought some people in and we did some stuff with the management company, which was great, but actually it was very interesting. A lot of their mindset was focused on senior exec teams and management teams, and it was different for them that we'd done this with everybody, and actually they were all part of it, and there's nobody left out of that in terms of where it goes. So it is very much encouraging that, and I think it's that part is it becomes a belonging thing. The other thing we've done really strongly, and we've been put to the testing where it goes, is very much developing a family first culture and understanding the roles that people play at different times. I think it comes back to the stuff that Leila talked about as well, is then that's about flexibility and where you go. And I know we've taken people from the sister organisation who was about to leave because we were able to offer flexible working. We got to, oh no, that shouldn't work in terms of where it goes. Well, rubbish, actually. You know, guess what? But someone, I've given them flexible working. Their experience and what they can do in a short period of time, because they're focused on it, is absolutely invaluable. And guess what? After a period of time, that changes and they've basically gone to a different role, or they want to expand their hours. Those things come in cycles and where you go. But guess what? They were definitely a major contributor. And it would have been crazy to go outside of the organisation or not bring them in terms of where they fit. But, you know, they would have been lost to the organisation. So, again, a really good example in where we sit in terms of how we do that.
That's a brilliant example there, and I won't talk too long because I know that you've got a number of other slides and some more questions, but I thought it was a perfect time to ask a question that we also had written into us. And this individual, I won't mention who it is actually in this instance. Obviously it is Chatham House rules here, but this particular individual is, he's a middle-aged white guy, and he is at the helm of his organisation, large organisation, very fixed culture, feeling incredibly frustrated at the fact that he cannot get buy-in from the wider organisation, so much so would consider potentially leaving. He has offered to own the D&I agenda himself and has started to push certain things himself. How have you found dealing with, and I know it didn't sound like there was necessarily too many issues with the mothership, and they leave you off to your own devices, which is great. But I think in some organisations that is not the case. Any advice on how you would deal with that?
What I would say is that I think the problem is people look at this in terms of an agenda which is that they see it as cost and not benefit, and I think they see it as nicest to have, etc. The way I would see it from the way we've done our business is this is about making your people feel valued, and it's your people who will deliver your result. So actually this needs to be dressed in terms of the fact that actually you're building your culture, you're building your teams to be, and to some extent we got to start with a clean sheet rather in terms of where we go. So everything was sort of, we could build from the bottom, but the reality is that's not the case. Once it starts to get bigger, you do have managers, you lose track. Once, when it was 9 people, I knew what was happening with everybody. Once it becomes 33 and they're all spread across the place, and particularly when you were not seeing them in a regular basis in the current culture, then it becomes more detached. And certainly you do have still, again, around recruitment in terms of approach, how things are managed, not so much people lack a D&I mindset, but they can sometimes lack a people skills mindset. And I think this is about kind of developing, for me, a people skills, and basically you start from the basis that all people deserve respect and value, and there's no differentiation between them on where they came from. So that's just a fundamental principle, and why the hell wouldn't it be like that? And I'm sorry, I have a real problem looking at it any other way. In terms of, if they come with attitude or various things that are negatives or kind of disrupt the team, that's a different back, but that's nothing to do with anything else about them other than how their behaviours are. And that's pretty much for me the way that you kind of look at it. Other people don't necessarily give the support, and I think that is the challenge piece, is that you do get different people with different needs. So I think the change you get into is a culture which is sometimes it doesn't ask those other questions, and that's the bit I've had to learn, is that I would focus very much on a conversation about work, and actually there is a mix in your organisation where people do need, and it's a bit like the old football manager thing in terms of some people need an arm around them, some people need a kind of just a straightforward bollocking in terms of where they go. There's a different background in where they go, but I think the wider your mix of people, you have to be effectively more challenged as a manager, but you should welcome that.
It's and I think it varies as well, doesn't it? As you say, from company to company, how much freedom are those businesses within groups actually allowed? How much can we, present back, if it's not known already, the business case, as opposed to this being a nice to have? David, I'm going to ask one more question, but if you would rather answer it in the next couple of slides, please do so. But we have someone who has said that they agree entirely that shared experiences are a great way to build an inclusive culture. So thank you very much for sharing. We wanted to do more around employee engagement and away days, as you mentioned, but we didn't seem to get much take up. Interested to hear how you approached this. Did it come from HR group, presumably, or another department? Did you have some employees who were more engaged than others?
So yes, for sure, we definitely got people who were more engaged. We got the people who sat at the back with their arms crossed and didn't want to kind of engage in terms of where that goes. So yeah, you get definite mixture of people in terms of where they go. In terms of the away days, I mean, ultimately that's about partly working with that. But I think what it's done is, if I look at now, I've got a situation where I've got a team that is worth the effort of trying to do it, because we've gone into a lockdown situation. I've got a team that does virtual coffee breaks a couple of days a week on Zoom, and I may not have time to get to them. They just go off and run them themselves in terms of where they go. They do a virtual pub on a Friday at 4 o'clock. It's actually sort of like it develops a kind of momentum of its own in terms of where it goes, and actually, ultimately you can't force people to kind of go down all of those routes, but you kind of make sure that you try and push it to be sort of an engagement piece, and people understand why it's of value to them. course you get people who don't want to know about well-being, think they know everything in terms of where they go. But actually, to be fair, over time, people begin to get it. And you get more people who say, wow, actually, I've never had this before. I've never had anyone putting the focus into us. We've never had this kind of time just about us, and not sort of like that. And it's not huge amounts. You're not talking about spending ridiculous amounts where it goes. Yes, we run things tight and we kind of manage things. And sometimes it gets questioned in where the budget goes. But yeah, I can't do massive lavish things, and it's not about that. You can do things in a simple way that actually still can create that effect, would be my feeling. So if I just flick on in terms of what we see is, basically we're very much sort of part of all this, and part of the inclusion is talk about how we focus on. So just go back to the slide before, if you may, Layla, just very quickly, is create this family first thing. So it really means, just to be very quick about it, is we've got a real understanding of each other's solutions, but we have a set of values that's more than just the P&L, and that people shouldn't feel embarrassed about having a challenge outside of work, or that, basically they have to do something, because actually the impact is we give flexibility, but we get far more in return. We've seen that basically people will make up and find ways to catch up on things in terms of the go, and we've gained talent that we wouldn't have got and wouldn't have got elsewhere. So basically it has opened the door in terms of the fact we can get people who are more challenged in where they go, and as I say, they've adapted really well. We moved at the beginning of March to home working, and we've opened the office, so if there's anybody struggling in their environment, they can go in there now. But actually, they've adapted incredibly well from March through to September, and there's still that sensing where it goes, yes, there's some people I'm still a bit concerned about who disappear off and kind of aren't in the same level of touch. But yeah, so if you go to the next slide, I think we've talked about the next slide a bit in terms of, we're definitely not recruiting people who look or talk the same, and that's very much in terms of where we go. And I think that works across all the managers, so I think we're all accepting of that in where we go. And it's basically using that process to try and get people to understand us in that recruitment process. But I think I've talked about the challenges and where we go. So yeah, we are looking to widen it. I think it's our big learn in terms of where we go. We'll continue to learn about how we can do that better. But yeah, I think overall we're in a situation where we've created a positive environment. It's keeping that down. When you start, dead easy, you can be in touch with everybody in the team. As it gets bigger, you can't do that, and that's the challenge as well, is how do you keep that and make sure that everybody's signed up to that. But I think there's still some of the things we can do as a wider organisation. We're still doing those kind of wider team events, and we're still making sure that's open to all. It's not just a management thing that they go off and do that. We've and particularly with this type of thing with Zoom, we've now got a situation where I've got an international badminton player and a rugby player who are kind of coming on and helping drive a coach. And it's a bit new to them in terms of where they go. We've kind of pulled them out of their comfort zone. But it does, had people who've been with us on our journey through, and they're going through huge challenges. And they're very open about talking about lockdown, because it basically has challenged them in their workload. So people get a very different perspective in terms of where they go in terms of the background. So our next challenge as well is then keeping what we've got, which is special for me, and then absorbing a global culture and kind of getting that blend of values, and just keeping the dynamic of growth we've got with whilst we're remote working. But growth isn't necessarily our biggest problem at the moment. We're kind of continuing to deliver against that, because we're as I say, we're going to have grown probably over 50% this year and looking to do the same next year. So inclusivity doesn't need to be exclusive to growth. So yes, I think that's it. Basically, we're going to grow. We're going to continue to value our people. I think that's the thing for me. It should be that if you're doing this and you're doing it right, it should help your business incentives and where you're going, and help you drive your growth. And as I say, what can we do to become more exclusive is basically what we continue to learn. And why we engage with Layla and the Dial team is because the learning never ends.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for sharing that, David, and the lovely plug at the end as well. But it is absolutely true, and I love that you as a CEO are actually driving this. You know, I've heard a huge amount there with, I mean, simplicity, engagement, rinsing, repeating, doing it again. It might sound, you know, like something incredibly basic, but running these events, doing these away days, eventually people do get it. Not giving up after it's happened the one time, not giving up because we are part of a larger organization and saying, well, rest of the business doesn't necessarily do that. Why can't we champion this as best practice, as a sub business within that? There is nothing to stop anyone, big companies, small companies, taking the initiative, you know, especially CEOs in particular, doing this. And as you mentioned there as well in the kind plug with us with Dial, obviously we're delighted to welcome Air Liquide as one of our corporate members, but everything that we are doing is very much around engagement, because it is a never-ending learning journey. And what we have, I mean, we've seen you obviously in the online community, which is excellent, chit-chatting away, which is wonderful, and able then to keep those people chatting, engaged, keep the fire burning, so it doesn't then necessarily rest all with yourself, because people are interested in different things. And it's that, you know, it's that persistent engagement that is, I'm hearing, you know, always not the challenge, but you know, something that is perhaps you know, difficult to maintain that momentum once you've come off the back of a away day, or come off the back of you know, doing a run for Dementia UK, or doing something you know, which people remember and enjoy with your sports coaches and things like that, doing things which are out of the norm, but doing new things and repeating that time and time again to make sure that eventually, even if there are a few stragglers, because there's always going to be that, isn't there, that momentum is maintained and people you know, eventually do jump on that bus.
They do, and I think that's the point, is you start to see those people who were reticent before now sort of do engage and enjoy being part of the team, and they engage, and I think that positivity rubs off eventually. So.
Well, one quick question here that's also been asked was around the family first culture. How did that come about? How did you go about developing that? Was it inspired by COVID, or was that?
No, that goes well back before COVID. I mean, we've basically always, I mean, again, particularly having a kind of a whole mixture of teams with different environments, a load of different challenges. Some of them have got health challenges, which kind of mean that they need sort of to go and flex things for medical needs. I've had people who've had bereavement of siblings and kind of challenges around that, and they're not from the UK. You know, effectively, if I've applied the strict corporate guidelines, we would have been running into problems. But the reality is I know that I value people on their contribution, not just in terms of, and it's about that. What are you doing with them, and how can you help them and support them through those processes? Because actually, it's not just about physical presence; it's about them being able to be present, and you know, and you believe in them in your organisation. So it comes in that fact. I mean, I know the challenge. We've had the challenge in terms of dementia, in terms of where I go, and I probably get beaten up by my team for being probably the person who kind of gives myself the least slack in terms of where it goes, in terms of where it goes. But the reality is that we ultimately have a philosophy in terms of it should be you managing your diary and not your diary managing you, in terms of where that sits. And I try and treat them with a sense of responsibility, and that's what we get back. But that also means that they should not be embarrassed about the fact, or I've always had a process with members of my team, which has been, for example, you know, if there's something happening at the school and your child, for hell's sake, prioritize. Those don't come round. There's certain things that come, you never get back. And actually, when people understand that in terms of that's got to be part of their prioritization, it actually, the value you get from them becomes more, their engagement becomes better, everything becomes more positive in terms of where you're going. My view is people do not look to kind of exploit that. They actually take it for what it is, and it kind of comes as a bit of a shock. And it's the non-monetary stuff you give to people, which actually, you know, I've sat at a kind of Christmas party where I've virtually had a queue of people in a sister organisation coming to me saying, "Are you sure there's not a space in your team?" And it comes from that. And ultimately, it's kind of, I'll go back to, it's about values and how you walk them and how you deliver them. So it feels the right thing to do. I've seen enough experience where people have had things. I've had people come to me on all sorts of levels on those where they've had challenges. But if you can work with them, they put a lot more in, and actually it becomes much more easy, and they can have those conversations, and they're not sitting fretting about it. It's done, and now they can think about what they're going to do today.
Absolutely, and that equals great for business as well.
Yeah, of
Great
course
for
it
the
is.
business, great for the bottom line. In addition, love that you as a CEO have been willing to share this, and love to. I wish that we had more CEOs who were like this. I'm sure others who are here on this call today are thinking very much the same thing. Now, if you have got any other questions, please do ask them in the chat. I'm going to summarise some of the key pieces that I've heard, and we will do this as well into the notes at the end of today's session. But David, thank you very, very much for sharing. I've heard a huge amount of, interwoven throughout the presentation of two-way street, of ethos. You give and you get. It is a two-way street, and that seemed to run through not only how you feel about your people and genuinely allowing that safe space, not just kind of paying lip service to it. If employees are coming to the CEO to talk about issues with childcare, with difficulties with flexi time, that you are doing the right thing, because it is a two-way street. And I love that filtered also into the recruitment process as well. And I think that's something that perhaps is not understood by all, is that when you do go for a job interview, it is both ways. It is not, gone are those days, or we hope in most organizations, where it is tell me what you can do for me. It is a both-way street. And certainly our new generations, now the largest generation in the workforce, are demanding more in terms of purpose from their employers. And so, no, it makes absolute sense. And must be doing the right thing if you're managing to pick up talent that would have otherwise left the organisation. So making sure that talent is secured, sticking your head above the parapet and making sure that you do challenge, because there's always going to be challenge. Challenge doesn't necessarily always mean a bad thing. Challenge, positive debate as to why this is important. And clearly you've not allowed it to stop you, whether the mothership is doing what you're doing or not. And I think that's really, really great to hear, because I think for some individuals certainly that we have spoken to, it's difficult pushing back, even as a leader, when there is a large global organization who does things a certain way. But we've always done it that way, we can't do it that way. Well, that is not to say, however small a division or a company you are within a large conglomerate, that you can't champion initiatives yourself and make a difference, make an impact, be known within that wider organization or wider team or teams or whatever it might be, for doing the right thing. And that still picks people up along the way. Heard a lot as well around repetition, which I think is very key. As you said, sometimes it is simplicity. Diversity, inclusion, belonging, it is not necessarily rocket science, but keeping the foot on the gas and making sure all are involved in something which is changing constantly is absolutely something that is difficult. So keeping it simple, making sure that we kind of rinse and repeat, make sure that we've got those safe spaces, make sure that we're keeping things fresh, bringing people in potentially to share stories, but encouraging storytelling internally. I know that you have kindly shared about your personal background and shared with your own team as well, around not only the positives but also the challenges. And I think that is key to keeping it human and keeping it real, because it's more authentic that way. None of us are perfect. We're all human beings at the end of the day, and so making sure that we are as honest and transparent within our means as we can be, I think is key. So thank you very much, David.